This is the BBC. For details of our complete range of programmes, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Welcome to the latest global news, recorded at 14 hours GMT on Monday, the 1st of January. I'm Jackie Leonard with a selection of highlights from across BBC World Service News today. Coming up, Iranian state media say 10 people were killed on Sunday during anti-government protests, which have continued despite warnings from the authorities. President Trump has tweeted that it's time for change in Iran. The North Korean leader Kim Jong-un says he has a nuclear button on his desk, but has also held out the prospect of talks with the South.
No matter how much the United States shows off their nuclear weapons and frantically provokes war, now that we have a deterrence, the US will not be able to do anything.
World recycling markets are being shaken up as China bans a number of waste imports.
That includes things like low-grade plastics, plastic drinking bottles, unsorted paper, some textiles, scrap and car tyres.
Also in this podcast, reports that African migrants are being used as slaves in Libya.
We spoke to several Nigerian migrants, and each of them told us of the same horrifying trend: prison authorities leasing or selling migrants to local businesses as labour.
And the unusual and quirky ways to usher in the new year. Iranian state television says 10 people were killed on Sunday night as anti-government protests continued across the country. In one of the incidents, 2 demonstrators were shot dead in the southern town of Izeh. Another 2 died during more unrest in the city of Darood in western Iran. The violence went on despite an appeal for calm from President Hassan Rouhani. He said that the nation would deal with those he described as a minority of lawbreakers.
In
recent days, we have witnessed some protests. Everyone must be aware at this point that we are a free nation, and according to the Constitution and human rights, the people are absolutely free to criticize the government and even to protest. But their protests should be done in such a way as to aim at the improvement of the situation in the country. Yes, people have problems in the economic and social spheres.
Rana Rahimpour from BBC Persian TV told us more details about the latest protests.
We know that protests continued in some of the cities. Right now, we know that there's heavy police presence in Tehran and some of the major hotspots of the protests.
So, heavy police presence, detentions, reports of these deaths. Is this the beginning of a big crackdown by the authorities?
Well, I think they have showed a lot of restraint so far. If they wanted to crack down the protests, we would have had many more people dead. How far are they going to go? It's difficult to predict. President Rouhani last night, in his first reaction to the protests, said that people should have the right to protest. Whether he's going to give that permission to people is unlikely. Over the last 4 decades, no anti-government protests got permission. So it's very unlikely that this time will be different. But I think they also sense a danger of a heavy crackdown and the possibility of it backfiring.
Now, as you say, these protests have been going on for a number of days now. Have they actually changed?
So originally, according to many reports, it was staged by some of President Rouhani's opponents who were defeated in the recent presidential elections in the city of Mashhad, where Raisi, President Rouhani's opponents, has many supporters. And originally it was against inflation and corruption and only against President Rouhani's government. But it was quickly hijacked by other protesters and it turned out against the entire regime.
That was Rana Rahimpour from BBC Persian. President Trump has been tweeting about the protests. He said that the great Iranian people had been repressed for many years. He added that they were hungry for food and freedom and that it's time for change. China has introduced new restrictions on the import of foreign waste in an effort to reduce pollution. The UK, among others, sends large amounts of waste plastic and paper to China every year. But the new ban, ordered by the Beijing government, is about to stop most of that, and it could have a significant impact on recycling. Robin Brandt reports from Shanghai.
China has been recycling for decades. In this grimy, smelly yard by a flyover in Shanghai, the workers sort on the ground floor and they live in tiny apartments on the floor above. Okay, let's have a look at this array of bags. And this one on the left, this is the biggest. Circuit boards, plastic power packs. This one, these are routers. This one, kind of phone packs, phone coverings. And this one, at the end, mice, computer mice. This man has made a living out of bashing, breaking up and disassembling. He's been doing it for 5 years. It's hard work, he told me. Tiring. But they are not green warriors. They live and work in this concrete yard because there's money in it. China needs the raw materials. So much so that Chinese workers have been sorting through your waste shipped in from abroad. The government is about to stop that. New environmental protection has made business difficult, he said. China has long been the destination for much of the world's waste. It imported 7.3 million tonnes of plastic alone in 2016. The UK sent 1,200 tonnes of it to China every day. But most of that is about to end. These children are crouching on a riverbank, picking up dead fish amid plastic bottles and bags. China has become a much richer but much dirtier country. It's blighted by homemade pollution and contamination on a vast scale. The government claims some foreign waste is dangerous, and the last thing this country needs is even more of that. Wang Wang is from the China Scrap Plastics Association.
China's ban is putting the onus back on all the waste exporting countries. You need to shoulder the responsibility of disposing your own waste and your own sources of pollution.
The ban presents a problem for China, though. It needs the paper, the cardboard, the clean, high-quality polystyrene that's simple to ship to this country and simple to turn into something you can then sell. This is an industrial chipper. It disintegrates polystyrene, tons of it. And somewhere in this load there are fish boxes from Grimsby on England's east coast. The business on the outskirts of Shanghai ships them, chips them, heats them, and then turns them into something to sell back to you. In a nutshell, it's pretty simple what they do here. They take this, a bit of polystyrene, it's compressed and sent here to China, and then they turn it into this. These are little green pellets of plastic about the size of half a peanut, and then eventually it's moulded into this, photo frames.
This is core components, all German.
And it cuts it, and then it comes out.
Yes, coming out.
But China's ban means the boss is going to have to send his UK waste elsewhere. Frank Liu said it will hit his supply.
Some people in China are very angry about importing of recycled plastic. But just keep the factory running, we need about 50,000 tons of recycled plastics. When you only recycle China, it's not enough.
The ban on foreign waste will hurt some business here, but the government's view is tough. Delivering a cleaner China is paramount for the Communist Party politicians. A green revolution, you might call it.
That was Robin Brandt in Shanghai. The fireworks, the happy crowds, it could have been any world city seeing in the new year, except that primetime TV also featured an address by the country's leader and a warning it had achieved, in his words, perfection of state nuclear forces, and that he had a nuclear button on his desk. Yes, this was North Korea welcoming 2018, and the leader was Kim Jong-un.
No matter how much the United States shows off their nuclear weapons and frantically provokes war, now that we have a deterrence, the US will not be able to do anything. And if North and South Korea put our minds together, we can easily prevent war. As a responsible, powerful nuclear state that promotes peace, we will not use our nuclear weapons unless an invasive enemy violates our sovereignty and interests. However, we will respond firmly against any actions that destroy peace and security.
The former British ambassador to North Korea, John Everard, says the speech included a significant change to the country's strategic doctrine.
Up until yesterday, North Korea's position was that North Korea would only use nuclear weapons first if its sovereignty was infringed upon by hostile aggressive forces with nuclear weapons. That is to say, that it would only use nuclear weapons against a nuclear weapon-armed state, effectively the United States in the North Korean context. The new doctrine, as of this morning, is that North Korea will only use nuclear weapons if its sovereignty and interests are infringed upon by hostile powers. Now, this means that under the new doctrine, North Korea feels it will be entitled to use nuclear weapons against, for example, South Korea or Japan. It's quite a worrying development.
Sophie Long is our correspondent in the South Korean capital, Seoul.
It was a defiant message to Washington. I don't think anyone was expecting anything less. He repeatedly called 2017 the year of accomplishment, that they achieved his nuclear ambitions despite all the pressures, the outside pressures against them. He told the United States that he has the nuclear arsenal to hit anywhere on the United States mainland, and he said he had a nuclear button on his desk. Now, does he have that capability to do that in that way? We don't know, but there have been several signs over the past year when they've carried out tests, both the sixth and most powerful nuclear test in September, and then what he said was an intercontinental ballistic missile in November, which he said could strike anywhere on the US mainland. So a very defiant message to Washington, but a much more conciliatory tone was taken in terms of South Korea, his neighbour. To them, he was saying that he was open to dialogue. He also said that he would be willing to think about sending a delegation to the Winter Olympics, which is being held in South Korea at the beginning of February. Something that's been very important to the government here. President Moon has said in the past that he thinks that if that were to happen, if they had North Korean athletes at the Winter Olympics, it could really mark a turning point in Korean relations, in the tensions that have been rising throughout 2017 here on the Korean Peninsula. We also got an indication that actually the sanctions are biting. There's been several rounds of UN sanctions imposed throughout 2017, the last of which was only a week or so ago in December. So very difficult at this stage for us to evaluate just what kind of impact they're having, particularly in the last week. There's been allegations that Russian ships and Chinese ships, both countries deny this, but that they were transferring oil, which is a violation of UN sanctions, to North Korean tankers at sea. So it's very difficult, very early days in terms of sanctions, to see exactly how much of an impact they're having on North Korea. But if you listen to his speech this morning, there was a very clear indication that he talked about hard times and everything they've achieved despite the pressures, the external pressures against them. That, I think, was very much a reference to those UN sanctions, which will continue to impact upon the North Korean regime as we enter 2018.
That was Sophie Long in Seoul. In the last 6 months, the number of migrants trying to cross the Mediterranean to reach Europe has fallen by 70%. That's been seen as a success for European Union policy, encouraging Libyan groups to police their coastline. But it means that hundreds of thousands of migrants are now stuck in the North African country, where the United Nations has described conditions as inhuman. The majority of African migrants are Nigerian. Those who've been repatriated have told harrowing stories of abuse and slavery. Stephanie Hegarty went to the city of Benin in southern Nigeria to meet some of them.
The government has a process of helping you get back on your feet.
In this hotel in Benin City, about 200 migrants, men and women, have just arrived. They got back from Libya only yesterday.
What happened in Libya is a very bad story. Let me put it that way. The Libyans are very wicked. I start thinking if the planet where they are from is not in this earth.
Lucky Akanene left for Libya in June. Like most of the people here, he's in his 20s, with a soft, open face and a scraggy beard. But his eyes are serious and tired. He tried to get to Europe by boat, but was arrested 2 months ago and sent to prison in a place called Garian.
My experience in Garian prison is worst. It's a very bad place. A lot of black slave trade in that place. They make money from blacks. They pick like 6 persons, they take them out to do their dirty jobs, the farming, the bricklaying works, to feed their cattle. They give us out to their friends. They don't pay us. If you are not fast with your job, you get beaten for it.
We spoke to several Nigerian migrants, cross-checking the details of their stories, and each of them told us of the same horrifying trend: prison authorities leasing or selling migrants to local businesses as labour.
Before they sell me as a slave in the prison, I witnessed close to 10 deaths.
Sent to Garian after being arrested on the Med, Jackson Owumorogi got home a few weeks ago. It was clear when we met that he wasn't well. His tracksuit bottoms were hanging from his long, skinny frame, and his face was slightly puffy and swollen.
He came at the night, he now counted 20 of us. And my brother was...
While he was in prison, he says a guard came and counted out a group of men. As he was being blindfolded, he heard the men discuss money. 1,000 dinars, about $800.
And you think the guard sold you?
Yes, he sold us. Because the man told us that we are sold as a slave. We don't have choice. The Mudinas take us to...
He says they were taken to a farm where they were forced to look after cattle and harvest onions. They were only given food every few days and given seawater to drink. After 6 months, they were taken to the desert.
They dump us there. So it's the help of God.
They were rescued by a man driving by and taken to his home, and then to the UN, who helped them get back to Nigeria. This is only the latest development in a dark and brutal industry, where for many years traffickers and prison guards have been extorting migrants, forcing them to buy their freedom. Again and again in our interviews, Garian is mentioned as a place of terrible abuse. It's run by Libya's Ministry of Interior, which itself is run by 2 militia groups. Libya is in the middle of a civil war, and these militia are only nominally under the UN-recognised government in Tripoli. They didn't respond to our attempts to set up an interview.
So they miss me a lot.
It's a bittersweet landing in Nigeria.
She's the only one I tell that I'm leaving home.
As this young man sees his cousin for the first time in months.
Look at her, she's rejoicing.
Carrying the trauma of what they've been through, these young people now have to begin the hard work of rebuilding their lives.
I really thank God after how many dead bodies.
That report was by Stephanie Hegarty in southern Nigeria. You're listening to Global News, the most important stories and the best interviews and on-the-spot reporting from the BBC World Service. And this is where I remind you that there are lots of other podcast series from the BBC World Service, and there's one place to go to find out what's new and fabulous, our newsletter. Search online for BBC World Service newsletter or go to bbcworldservice.com/newsletter. Sign up and the newsletter with its podcast recommendations will be sent straight to your inbox. You're welcome. Governments in 2 major oil-producing countries in the Middle East are taking steps to reduce their dependence on oil revenue. With the start of the new year, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have introduced a value-added tax which affects consumers. A number of other countries in the region are expected to take similar measures in the coming years. Our economics correspondent Andrew Walker reports.
Oil prices have moved sharply since a decline began in mid-2014. At the lowest point, they were down about 3/4 before staging a partial recovery. The swings have also brought instability to government finances in oil-producing nations, so many are keen to find other, less turbulent sources of revenue. 6 countries in the Gulf have agreed to introduce a value-added tax, which ultimately falls on consumers. For 2 of them, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, the new tax comes in with the new year, while the others plan to follow when they're ready. The tax will apply to most goods and services at a rate of 5%. All 6 countries in the Gulf Cooperation Council have seen government revenue fall in the last few years. In the case of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, the decline has been almost 50% since 2012. There has been a corresponding deterioration in the balance of government finances. In 2012, all but Bahrain had surpluses, revenue that exceeded government spending. Kuwait still does, but it's shrunk dramatically, and the other 5 countries all have deficits. The moves to diversify government revenue reflect recent developments in the oil market. But there's a longer-term issue too, the possibility that global efforts to tackle climate change may undermine demand for fossil fuels and further restrict their scope to finance government spending from oil revenue.
Andrew Walker, our economics correspondent. And now...
I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth. Educated at a private school in England. I run my own firm in the city. I'm very happy with my life the way it is.
и они все равно придут за тобой.
The world of global crime syndicates as captured in a new BBC drama series that begins on Monday night here in the UK. McMafia tells the fictional story of a man born into a crime family and his relationship with the shady world around him of tax evasion, smuggling, drugs and violence. It's based on a non-fiction account of organised crime by the author Misha Glenny, and he's been talking to Razia Iqbal.
Was about the globalization of criminality in the 1990s and the first decade of this millennium. I was working in the former Yugoslavia during the wars, and one of the things that all of us observed was the fact that a lot of the militias who were doing a lot of the killings were also organized crime groups who were shifting illicit goods and services, heroin, cocaine, women trafficked from Eastern Europe, through Yugoslavia into their biggest market, which was the European Union. So there was a sort of, global chain of illicit activity, which was growing very, very fast. And what I did with the book was basically identify that two things had happened. First, there was the big bang of the 1980s when there were all restrictions on capital were lifted and people could move money over the world very quickly. And secondly, there was the collapse of communism, a sudden dramatic shift from a planned economy to a market economy in large parts of the world. And you also saw other economies like the Brazilian, the Indian, the South African, the Chinese economies opening up, but nobody really able to police this brave new world. And so the new businessmen, in order to ensure their contracts were sacred, had to rely on what sociologists call privatized law enforcement agencies, but what we colloquially know as the mafia. And so you had mafias springing up all over the world, and very quickly they realized they could talk to each other and do business.
So now we're going to see a fictionalised account of your non-fiction investigation. 9 years on, What's changed?
Well, I think that the mafia culture has spread. It's become more acceptable in certain parts of the world. This culture is penetrating the very highest offices around the world. Certainly there's enough hovering around, as it were. So that's one thing. But there's also been a pushback, and it's really important, this. We have the largest corruption scandal in history, I think, in Brazil. And that has been driven by prosecutors appalled by the corruption of the Brazilian political and sort of criminal milieu. We've seen organizations like Transparency International stand up against corruption and organized crime, NGOs like Global Witness. And then we've had the Paradise Papers and the Panama Papers. So we know ever more of what is going on in tax havens, who is shifting money, what is the product that they're shifting across the world, where the heroin's coming through and that sort of thing. And so there's a real battle on. McMafia culture does not have it all its own way.
Drugs have always been at the heart of the way in which organised crime operates. What has shifted in the context of the legalising of drugs, particularly marijuana, in certain countries, in certain states in the US?
This is an incredibly important question because drugs is always an easy entry into the world of organised crime, and it is one of the biggest earners. The profit margins in the illegal drugs trade are absolutely stupendous. So what is happening in the United States, and that is the gradual legalization of marijuana on a state-by-state basis for recreational purposes, but the United States is likely very soon to be joined by the whole of Canada. We've also seen certain deregulation or certain sort of legalization or decriminalization in places like Portugal, Switzerland, Holland, most of Central and South America. This is an absolute game changer. First of all, it's taking out the narcotic which is most consumed around the world. And secondly, if you look at somewhere like Colorado, where they've had legalized marijuana for 3 years now, Western civilization hasn't collapsed there after 3 years. But not only that, last year, Colorado took in over $100 million in tax revenue from marijuana, twice as much as they do from alcohol. And this money is hypothecated to a degree into health services, into other areas of social welfare. And states very quickly become dependent on that sort of revenue. So I think the legalization of marijuana is going to roll across certainly the United States, North America, South America, and many parts of Europe. And that when people see that you can have a regulated, legalized marijuana market, it may start to move profits away from there, and organized crime will have less of a fertile ground to work with. But I would say that the internet and synthetic drugs are also very problematic and beginning to change the whole drug market.
That was Misha Glenny speaking to Razia Iqbal. A musical about the experience of being a refugee is set to tour Germany this year. Called Hoch hinaus, which means flying high, it's the brainchild of the African-American musician Todd Fletcher. Todd selected a group of refugees living in Germany, most of them children, from Syria, Afghanistan and Libya. One of the key characters is Maher, an 18-year-old boy from Aleppo in Syria. He arrived in Germany in 2015, alone after an arduous journey that took him to Turkey and across Europe. The BBC's Nkem Ifejika spoke to Maher and Todd Fletcher.
It really sparked the idea with me when I went to visit a friend who was running a shelter. And I walked in, and at the time there were 300 young men, and they were just sitting around on their phones doing nothing. And I thought, look at these people, they could be doing something. And then several of them came to me and asked me, are you a German teacher? We'd like to learn German. And so it began with the idea of giving them something, anything to do. And if that something, anything, would help them learn German and then help them be able to contribute to society, I thought that's what I want to do. And so it's a sort of crazy American idea, I guess, let's do a musical and save the world. But that's what we did.
Maher, because Todd talks about being in the shelter and seeing you guys hanging around, or people like you hanging around and not doing anything. Were you thinking that I'm not doing anything, what I'd like to do is sing?
I'm just thinking that I'm nobody, I'm unuseful, and when I'm just sitting on my phone, don't do anything important to me to improve myself, it's just like nothing, I feel nothing.
So why did you agree to sing?
First of all, I didn't think that I will sing in my life. And I like to sing, I love. And when Papa Todd told me, you will sing, I didn't have any problem with it. So I just did it.
Todd, did I hear Maher call you Baba Todd?
Yes. And I wish they would call me Brother Todd, but this idea of Baba Todd caught on at some point, because we have become, in some senses, a family. And with me, I guess, as the dad, the choreographer as the mom, and a bunch of kids, 50 kids running around.
Is this musical just fun, or is there a message?
It's both. Like, the story, it's the same with the refugee story, that they coming to Germany and they had this a long way, hard way, and they didn't give up. And yeah, I had a lot of fun doing this with my new friends.
Maher, the journey, tell us about the process of getting to the stage and to the performance. How did that change you, the experience?
It was a wonderful experience to do this project, because I met a lot of new friends, and I changed myself with Baba Todd. He told me, you have to act and sing and dance, and I have never done this before. And at the first, I didn't believe in myself, and Baba Todd taught me how I believe in myself, how I get something done with give the thing all I got and work hard on it.
For me, this project was about showing these kids and their families and their friends and Germans in Europe, and thanks to the BBC, perhaps the world, what they're capable of. So by showing them that they could do something, they develop a certain confidence and strength that carries through in other ways.
Maha and Todd Fletcher, a.k.a. Baba Todd, were in conversation with Nkem Ifejika. And finally, people across the world have been celebrating the start of 2018. Champagne, fireworks and parties are typical ways of seeing in the new year. But there are some traditions you might not have heard of. Riley Carlson takes a look at some of the more unusual ways people around the world usher in the new year.
It's one of the most recognizable ways to ring in the new year, the ball drop in New York's Times Square. It's iconic, sure, but not as creative as other towns in the USA. Take, for instance, Tallapoosa, Georgia, where they lower an opossum, a stuffed one named Spencer. Or Raleigh, North Carolina, where it's a 410-kilogram copper and steel acorn. They count down with a sardine in Eastport, Maine, at least for midnight Eastern time. They also drop a giant maple leaf an hour earlier for their close Canadian neighbors on Atlantic time. In Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, it's a wrench they drop. There are 2 cities that drop giant popcorn balls and 2 cities that drop pickles. One is Dillsburg, Pennsylvania, but it was canceled this year because of freezing temperatures. Americans may like to drop things, but they're throwing dishes in Denmark and Germany. Breaking plates on other people's houses is a sign of good luck and camaraderie. In South Africa, they throw furniture out the window as a symbol of new beginnings. And color matters throughout Latin America, at least when it comes to your underwear. Red if you're seeking love in the new year, green for money maybe. You can celebrate in Switzerland by dropping ice cream on the floor, although it may be more enjoyable just to eat it. And in Spain, it's 12 grapes at midnight, one eaten at each chime of the clock to bring luck throughout the year.
Riley Carlson there, with a shout-out to Spencer the Opossum. And that's it from us for now, but an updated version of the Global News podcast will be available for you to download later. If you'd like to comment on this podcast or tell us your New Year's resolutions, do please send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk, or tweet using the hashtag GlobalNewsPod. Damien Sherman has already done so. His resolutions are love more, hate less, listen to more BBC World Service news pods. Good work, Damien. Tell your friends. And that's it for now. I'm Jackie Leonard, and from all of us here at the Global News Pod, have a very happy New Year.